This is a Best in Climate episode of Earth Feels, where each week your hosts Rose and Christine read to you from some of the best climate-related blogs and articles on the web.
Hi there, it's Rose with this week's Best in Climate. And if you're like me, last week's IPCC report was pretty devastating. I realize some of us are on vacation this summer, and some of us are just taking a break from social media and all the dire reportings. Some of us are just taking a break from life in general. The energy has been feeling pretty heavy, and I know that I myself have been doing this. I think it's important to find the joy in every day and see the beauty in the world around us. This week's IPCC report detailed some pretty dire consequences, detailed really where we are and what we can expect by 2030 and again by 2050, whether we take action and whether we don't take action. So I just wanted to read this particular article to you that was originally published in The Conversation under a Creative Commons license. So it gives me opportunity to read it to you directly. And it's entitled, "This is the most sobering report card yet on climate change and Earth's future. Here's what you need to know. Earth has warmed 1.09 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times, and many changes, such as sea level rise and glacier melt, are now virtually irreversible, according to the most sobering report yet by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change." That's the IPCC. The report also found escape from human-caused climate change is no longer possible. Climate change is now affecting every continent, region, and ocean on Earth, and every facet of the weather. The long-awaited report is the sixth assessment of its kind since the panel was formed in 1988. It will give world leaders the most timely, accurate information about climate change ahead of a crucial international summit in Glasgow, Scotland, in November. As an aside, that's COP26. The IPCC is the peak climate science body of the United Nations and the World Meteorological Organization. It is the global authority on the state of the Earth's climate and how human activities affect it. We are the authors of the latest IPCC report and have drawn from the work of thousands of scientists from around the world to produce this new assessment. So I wanted to say, this Rose again, another aside, this report is the culmination of 5-year assessment, writing, review, and approval process from 234 leading scientists from over 60 countries. And the scientists have worked together to evaluate the world's climate research papers, more than 14,000 of them in all. So back to the article. Sadly, there was hardly any good news in the 3,900 pages of text released today. But there is still time to avert the worst damage if humanity chooses to. It's unequivocal. Humans are warming the planet. For the first time, the IPCC states unequivocally, leaving absolutely no room for doubt, humans are responsible for the observed warming of the atmosphere, lands, and oceans. The IPCC finds Earth's global surface temperature warmed 1.09 degrees Celsius between 1850 and 1900 and the last decade. This is 0.29 degrees Celsius warmer than the previous IPCC report in 2013. Although it should be noted that 0.1 degrees Celsius of the increase is due to data improvements. The IPCC recognizes the role of natural changes to Earth's climate. However, it finds that 1.07 degrees Celsius of the 1.09 degrees Celsius warming is due to greenhouse gases associated with human activities. In other words, pretty much all global warming is due to humans. Global surface temperature has warmed faster since 1970 than in any other 50-year period for over at least the last 2,000 years, with the warming also reaching ocean depths below 2,000 meters. The IPCC says human activities have also affected global precipitation, rain and snow. Since 1950, total global precipitation has increased, but while some regions have become wetter, others have become drier. The frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation events have increased over most land areas. This is because the warmer atmosphere is able to hold more moisture, about 7% more for each additional degree of temperature, which makes wet seasons and rainfall events wetter. Higher concentrations of CO2 growing faster. Present-day global concentrations of atmospheric carbon dioxide, CO2, are higher and rising faster than at any time in the last 2 million years. The speed at which atmospheric CO2 has increased since the Industrial Revolution, the year 1750, is at least 10 times faster than at any other time during the last 800,000 years, and between 4 and 5 times faster than during the last 56 million years. About 85% of CO2 emissions are from burning fossil fuels. The remaining 15% are generated from land use change, such as deforestation and degradation. Concentrations of other greenhouse gases are not doing any better. Both methane and nitrous oxide, the second and third biggest contributors to global warming after CO2, have also increased more quickly. Methane emissions from human activities largely come from livestock and the fossil fuel industry. And nitrous oxide emissions largely come from the use of nitrogen fertilizer on crops. Extreme weather on the rise. Hot extremes, heat waves, and heavy rain have also become more frequent and intense across most land regions since 1950, the IPCC confirms. The report highlights that some recently observed hot extremes, such as the Australian summer of 2012-2013, would have been extremely unlikely without human influence on the climate. Human influence has also been detected for the first time in compounded extreme events. For example, incidents of heat waves, droughts, and fire weather happening at the same time are now more frequent. These compound events have been seen in Australia, Southern Europe, Northern Eurasia, parts of the Americas, and African tropical forests. Oceans, hotter, higher, and more acidic. Oceans absorb 91% of the energy from the increased atmospheric greenhouse gases. This has led to ocean warming and more marine heat waves, particularly over the last 15 years. Marine heat waves cause the mass death of marine life, such as the coral bleaching events. They also cause algal blooms and shifts in the composition of species. Even if the world restricts warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, as is consistent with the Paris Agreement, marine heat waves will become 4 times more frequent by the end of the century. Melting ice sheets and glaciers, along with the expansion of the ocean as it warms, have led to a global mean sea level increase of 0.2 meters between 1901 and 2018. But importantly, the speed sea level is rising is accelerating. 1.3 millimeters per year during 1901 to 1971, 1.9 millimeters per year during 71 to 2006, and 3.7 millimeters per year during 2006 to 2018. Ocean acidification caused by the uptake of CO2 has occurred over all oceans and is reaching depths beyond 2,000 meters in the Southern Ocean and the North Atlantic. Many changes are already irreversible. The IPCC says if Earth's climate was stabilized soon, some climate change-induced damage could not be reversed within centuries or even millennia. For example, global warming of 2 degrees Celsius this century will lead to an average global sea level rise of between 2 and 6 meters over 2,000 years, and much more for higher emission scenarios. Globally, glaciers have been synchronously retreating since 1950 and are projected to continue to melt for decades after the global temperature is stabilized. Meanwhile, the acidification of the deep ocean will remain for thousands of years after CO2 emissions cease. The report does not identify any possible abrupt changes that would lead to an acceleration of global warming during this century, but it does not rule out such possibilities. The prospect of permafrost, frozen soils in Alaska, Canada, and Russia crossing a tipping point has been widely discussed. The concern is that as frozen ground thaws, large amounts of carbon accumulated over thousands of years from dead plants and animals could be released as they decompose. The report does not identify any globally significant abrupt change in these regions over this century, based on currently available evidence. However, it projects permafrost areas will reach about 66 billion tons of CO2 for each additional degree of warming. These emissions are irreversible during the century under all warming scenarios. How can we stabilize the climate? Earth's surface temperature will continue to increase until at least 2050 under all emission scenarios considered in the report. The assessment shows Earth could well exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming limit by the early 2030s. Rose here, and I don't know how anyone cannot feel devastated by that. That's 8 years away. If we reduce emissions sufficiently, there is only a 50% chance global temperature rise will stay around 1.5 degrees Celsius, including a temporary overshoot of up to 0.1 degrees Celsius. To get Earth back to below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, CO2 would need to be removed from the atmosphere using negative emissions technologies or nature-based solutions. Global warming stays below 2 degrees Celsius during this century only under scenarios where CO2 emissions reach net zero around or after 2050. The IPCC analyzed future climate projections from dozens of climate models produced by more than 50 modeling centers around the world. It showed global average surface temperatures rising between 1.1 to 1.8 degrees Celsius and 3 to 5.7 degrees Celsius this century, above pre-industrial levels for the lowest and highest emission scenarios, respectively. The exact increase the world experiences will depend on how much more greenhouse gases are emitted. The report states with high certainty that to stabilize the climate, CO2 emissions must reach net zero, and other greenhouse gas emissions must decline significantly. We also know for a given temperature target, there's a finite amount of carbon we can emit before reaching net zero emissions. To have a 50-50 chance of halting warming at around 1.5 degrees Celsius, this quantity is about 500 billion tons of CO2. So at current levels of CO2 emissions, this, quote, carbon budget, unquote, would be used up in 12 years. Exhausting the budget will take longer if emissions begin to decline. The IPCC's latest findings are alarming, but no physical or environmental impediments exist to hold warming to below 2 degrees Celsius and limit it to around 1.5 degrees Celsius, the globally agreed goals of the Paris Agreement. I'll read that again. No physical or environmental impediments exist to hold warming below 2 degrees Celsius and limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Nothing there. Humanity, however, must choose to act. So there you have it. It's pretty devastating, and this is just the summary. The article was written by Pep Canadell, who's the Chief Research Scientist, Climate Science Center, CSIRO, Oceans and Atmosphere, and the Executive Director of the Global Carbon Project. Also, Joelle Georges, who's the Senior Lecturer in Climate Science at Australian National University, Malte Meinshausen, an Associate Professor at the School of Earth Sciences at the University of Melbourne, Mark Heemer, Principal Research Scientist, Oceans and Atmosphere at CSIRO, and Michael Gross, Climate Projection Scientist of CSIRO. Again, the IPCC report is the culmination of a 5-year assessment, writing, review, and approval process that looked at 14,000 research papers from 234 leading scientists hailing from more than 60 countries. Climate change is happening everywhere, and it's human-caused. I think we've reached the point where most of us know that. I don't usually include an action step in a Best in Climate episode, but because of the dire circumstances we're under now that aren't going away, I want to urge anyone who's listening to write to your president, your prime minister, any or all of your government officials, reiterating that we are at the tipping point and that the IPCC report is clear. If you're willing to do this, ask one other person to do it as well. The change isn't coming from the top. The change is going to come from the bottom up. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time. Bye-bye.
That's this week's episode of Best in Climate for Earth Feels.
Special thanks to singer-songwriter Kristen Hoffman for generously allowing us to use Song for the Ocean. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Children of the earth, I'm calling out. There's a mission for you and for me.